Look at the sheer, terrifying perfection of the universe. The precise orbit of the planets, the arc of a thrown stone, the massive, invisible forces holding reality together. The absolute greatest intellectual leap in the history of human survival was the moment we finally decoded the mathematical laws governing motion and force. When you picture the absolute greatest genius in the history of science, the solitary mind who finally shattered the ignorance of the ancient world and discovered the invisible mechanics of reality, who do you picture? You are taught to revere the British mathematician, Sir Isaac Newton. You picture an apple falling from a tree in a quiet English orchard in the 17th century, miraculously triggering the discovery of gravity and the laws of motion. You are told that before 1687, the entire world was completely blind to the true physics of the universe, until the West alone woke up and figured it out. We are taught that the West alone possessed the empirical rationality and the sheer mathematical genius to look at the physical world and decode its invisible laws. But the absolute foundational blueprint for modern physics was not drafted in the halls of Cambridge. The mechanical realization that an object in motion stays in motion was not discovered under an apple tree. And the very concept of inertia that dictates every rocket launch, every moving vehicle, and every planetary orbit today was not engineered by a British knight. It was explicitly mapped out, written down, and mathematically defined over 600 years earlier by an Islamic polymath operating in 11th century Persia. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the physics heist and how an 11th century Persian actually discovered the laws of motion. What follows is the story of a massive scientific cover-up, and one of the most blatant acts of academic identity theft the Western scientific establishment absolutely does not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who refuses to accept the heavily curated, highly sanitized historical narratives handed to you in school, if you want to know the actual, hidden architects of modern science, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us begin with the official timeline of physics. The version of classical mechanics you were tested on in high school, which meticulously paints Europe as the sole, undisputed pioneer of rational, mathematical reality. According to the Western narrative, the story of physics before the scientific revolution was completely paralyzed by the flawed philosophy of ancient Greece. For nearly 2,000 years, you are told, the entire world blindly accepted the physics of Aristotle. Aristotle taught that the natural, default state of every physical object was to be completely at rest. He believed that if you threw a rock, the only reason it kept moving through the air was because the air itself was constantly rushing behind it to push it forward. Under this ancient Greek dogma, motion required constant, active, external force from the environment. If the air stopped pushing, the object immediately wanted to stop and fall to the ground. There was no concept of internal momentum. There was no concept of inertia. The textbook claims that this heavily flawed, unscientific paralysis blinded human intellect until the miraculous dawn of the European intellectual awakening. Suddenly, the narrative claims, the European mind breaks free. In the 17th century, figures like Galileo begin dropping spheres from towers and rolling balls down inclined planes. Then, the narrative reaches its absolute climax in the year 1687. Sir Isaac Newton publishes the Principia Mathematica. He officially writes his first law of motion: an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced external force. He coins the law of inertia. He goes on to write his second law, proving that force equals mass times acceleration. The West completely crowns itself. Europe boldly declares that the monumental transition from the flawed philosophy of ancient Greece to the hard mathematical science of classical mechanics is the pure, unadulterated invention of the Western mind. They draw a straight, unbroken line from the dark ages of Aristotelian logic directly to Isaac Newton, completely ignoring a massive, glaring, 600-year gap in the timeline of human observation. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at the massive volumes of physics and mechanics written centuries before Isaac Newton was even born, and if you read the exact Arabic and Persian phrases describing momentum, force, and continuous motion, that beautiful, isolated narrative of Western physical genius completely shatters. To find the true father of classical mechanics, we have to completely abandon the prestigious academic halls of 17th century England. We have to travel back in time, over 600 years before Newton ever published his Principia. We have to travel to the highly advanced, intellectually fearless landscape of 11th century Persia. In the early thousands, while Europe was locked in a static, deeply superstitious view of the physical world, the Islamic Golden Age was operating on a completely different plane of scientific reality. Islamic scholars did not just blindly accept ancient Greek texts, they rigorously tested them, challenged them, and broke them apart. And operating directly inside this vibrant, unrestricted intellectual ecosystem was a brilliant Persian physician, astronomer, and physicist named Abu Ali Sina, universally known to the West as Avicenna. Avicenna was a towering genius of the ancient world, but he was not a man who simply accepted the authority of the ancients. He looked at Aristotle's physics, he looked at how objects actually moved in the physical world, and he realized that the Greek god of philosophy was completely, fundamentally wrong. Avicenna realized that air does not push a thrown object forward. In fact, he deduced through rigorous observation that air does the exact opposite. It acts as a resistance, creating friction and slowing the object down. Driven by this massive, perception-altering epiphany, Avicenna began the very first rigorous, scientific teardown of ancient physics. He realized that when a human arm throws a stone, the arm transfers an invisible, internal force directly into the stone itself. The motion did not belong to the air, the motion belonged to the object. In the year 1027, Avicenna published his massive encyclopedia of science, the Book of Healing, and inside the physics section of this monumental text, Avicenna explicitly coined a revolutionary new scientific concept. He called it Mayl. Mayl translates roughly to inclination or impetus. It is the invisible, transferred energy that keeps an object moving long after the thrower has let it go. He was the first human in recorded history to accurately describe the mechanics of momentum. But Avicenna did not stop there. He was about to take this concept of Mayl and execute a thought experiment so profound, so mechanically precise, that it would completely destroy the Western monopoly on the origins of physics. He was about to write the absolute core engine of the law of inertia, a staggering 6 centuries before Isaac Newton claimed to have discovered it. Inside the pages of the Book of Healing, Avicenna achieved something that shatters the entire timeline of Western physics. He constructed a theoretical thought experiment that completely destroyed the ancient Greek understanding of the universe. He asked his readers to imagine a perfect void, a vacuum, completely empty of air, friction, or any environmental resistance. He stated explicitly that if you were to throw a stone inside this perfect vacuum, the Mayl, the internal momentum transferred to the stone, would never be depleted. Because there was no air resistance to slow it down, and no external force to stop it, the stone would literally never stop moving. It would travel in a straight line for eternity. Let the absolute magnitude of that physical realization sink in. An object in motion will stay in motion indefinitely, unless acted upon by an outside force. He had just perfectly, flawlessly, articulated the exact mechanical definition of the law of inertia. He completely stripped the necessity of a continuous external push out of the physical equation. He proved that motion is a state of being, not a process that requires constant environmental fueling. He had just written Newton's first law of motion, a staggering 600 years before Isaac Newton was even born. And the Islamic Golden Age did not stop at the first law. Shortly after Avicenna, another brilliant philosopher and physicist named Hibat Allah Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi took the mechanics of motion even further. He began to rigorously study the mechanics of falling objects. He looked at how a stone drops from a height and realized that gravity acts as a continuous, relentless force pulling on the mass of the object. Abul Barakat explicitly wrote that a continuous force applied to an object does not just create a constant speed. A continuous force produces continuous acceleration. He proved mathematically that the longer the force is applied, the faster the object goes. He had just explicitly mapped out the absolute foundational concept of Newton's second law of motion. Force equals mass times acceleration. Let that reality completely wash over you. The realization of momentum, the realization of inertia, the realization that continuous force causes acceleration. They were utilizing the exact mathematical and physical framework that Galileo and Isaac Newton would claim to have miraculously invented, a staggering half a millennium later in Europe. So, a massive, terrifying question emerges for the defenders of the European scientific revolution. If the exact mechanics of inertia, momentum, and acceleration were all established, documented, and actively taught in the Islamic world in the 11th and 12th centuries, how did a British mathematician in the 17th century get all the credit? How did the West successfully execute this massive academic cover-up, claiming they invented classical mechanics out of thin air? To answer that terrifying question, we have to completely dismantle the myth of the isolated European scientific awakening. We have to look at the massive, highly organized, and deliberately obscured academic translation network of the Middle Ages. You are taught that the scientific revolution was a closed intellectual loop. You are told that in the 17th century, Western scientists simply woke up, dropped some apples, looked at the stars, and spontaneously invented physics. The Western narrative violently insists that the architecture of classical mechanics is a purely European invention, completely untainted by the outside world. But the academic, linguistic, and historical reality of European universities destroys that myth completely. During the 12th and 13th centuries, European scholars were absolutely desperate for advanced scientific knowledge. They heavily, aggressively translated massive Arabic physics and philosophy texts into Latin. And these translations did not just sit in dusty archives. They became the absolute core curriculum of the most prestigious universities in Europe. By the 14th century, the greatest physics minds in Europe, scholars at the University of Paris, like the famous Jean Buridan, were intimately reading the exact Latin translations of Avicenna's physics. Jean Buridan read Avicenna's concept of Mayl. He saw the brilliant, flawless mechanical explanation of momentum and inertia. And he did exactly what the Western academic establishment would do for centuries to come. He took the Arabic concept, translated it directly into the Latin word impetus, and integrated it into the European scientific curriculum. The impetus theory became the absolute, undisputed foundation of European physics for the next 300 years. When Renaissance scientists like Galileo and later Isaac Newton were studying the mechanics of motion, they were not starting from scratch. They were heavily, deeply referencing this translated impetus theory. They were standing directly on the physical blueprints drafted by Persian and Arab scholars centuries prior. The knowledge that objects retain momentum, that force causes acceleration, and that motion is a continuous state was not invented by the European Enlightenment. It was actively imported, translated, and absorbed from the Islamic Golden Age. But the Western academic establishment had a major, terrifying ideological problem. As Europe entered the age of global empire, they built an entire intellectual identity based on the absolute supremacy of the white European mind. They were aggressively conquering the globe, claiming to bring rational science and enlightenment to the backward East. They could not publicly admit that the greatest, most profound, most universe-shattering realizations about the mechanical laws of reality were actually engineered by the very Islamic civilization they were trying to dominate and marginalize. It would completely destroy their fragile, supremacist narrative of Western intellectual exceptionalism. So, they engaged in a deliberate, highly calculated process of academic erasure. When Western historians of science compiled the definitive timeline of physics, they executed a massive, deliberate historical blind spot. They drew a straight, unbroken line from the ancient Greek philosophers directly to Galileo and Newton, completely skipping over the 600 years of highly advanced, heavily translated Islamic physics. They took Avicenna, a man who had literally written the world's first physical manuscript, detailing momentum and the exact mechanical definition of inertia in a perfect vacuum, and they systematically scrubbed his name from the physics curriculum. This massive, highly successful historical erasure set the perfect stage for the ultimate scientific heist. By the time the 17th and 18th centuries arrived, the West had completely convinced itself that they were the undisputed pioneers of physical reality. Let us look at Sir Isaac Newton, the legendary figure universally worshipped by Western textbooks as the absolute god of classical mechanics. Newton famously declared, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Western history treats this as a beautiful testament to his humility, assuming he meant European astronomers like Kepler or Copernicus. But the West deliberately erased exactly whose shoulders he was standing on when it came to the fundamental mechanics of motion. The fundamental realization that an object in motion stays in motion, and that continuous force causes acceleration, is the exact, fundamental concept that Avicenna and Abul-Barakat established in the Middle East centuries prior. Newton did not invent the concept of inertia. He was undeniably a mathematical genius who codified these physical principles into a brilliant, unifying mathematical formula. But he did not discover the mechanics. He simply applied his mathematics to the exact mechanical blueprints that Islamic polymaths had already written, packaged it for a Western audience, and passed the core concept off as the spontaneous invention of the British Enlightenment. The Western pioneers of physics were undeniably brilliant mathematicians, but they were not the original architects of the physical laws. They were the inheritors of a massive, heavily translated, highly advanced Islamic scientific legacy. The Western scientific establishment did not discover the mechanics of motion out of thin air. They simply translated the Book of Healing, absorbed its physical framework to understand the very objects moving around them, and then had the absolute arrogance to claim they had invented the laws of the universe. Do you see the absolute arrogance of the Heist? First, they heavily translated the massive Persian and Arabic encyclopedias and absorbed the concepts of Mayl and continuous acceleration into their own universities. Then, they used that exact philosophical framework to structure their own physical observations. And finally, when the brilliance of the science became the undisputed foundation of the modern world, they simply erased the Islamic physicists from the timeline of human discovery, passing off their genius as the miraculous invention of a man sitting under an apple tree. They took the absolute foundation of classical mechanics, smashed the Persian name off the laboratory door, and slapped a British patent on the universe. They built modern physics on a stolen blueprint. Today, we live in a world completely dictated by these physical laws. We build massive space agencies. We launch rockets into the cosmos, put satellites into orbit, and land rovers on Mars, relying entirely on the clinical, mathematical understanding of inertia, momentum, and acceleration. We sit in university physics classes and nod along as professors praise the unique, unparalleled, isolated genius of Sir Isaac Newton and the scientific revolution. We are told that the West alone crawled out of the darkness of ancient ignorance and figured out how to safely navigate the mechanics of reality. But the modern physical mind was not born under an apple tree in England. The mechanical reality of inertia was not discovered in the 17th century. The absolute foundation of classical mechanics, momentum, and the laws of motion was entirely awakened, shaped, and permanently defined by Islamic polymaths in the 11th and 12th centuries. Modern physics is not a spontaneous European miracle. It is a massive, highly successful scientific heist. The West didn't discover the laws of motion. They simply walked into an Islamic intellectual library, translated the physics manuals, finally applied advanced mathematics to the concepts, and then convinced the rest of the planet that they had invented reality itself. Everything you just heard is documented. The massive, undeniable physical reality of Avicenna's 11th century manuscript, the Book of Healing, is sitting right there in the historical archives. The exact, flawless clinical articulation of Mayl, momentum, and the realization of inertia in a perfect vacuum centuries before Europe even understood the concept is an undisputed historical fact. The undeniable existence of European academics actively translating and studying these exact Arabic physics theories under the title of Impetus is a matter of absolute physical record. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is the true father of the laws of motion deliberately kept out of your textbook? If this completely shattered how you see the history of science, the birth of physics, and the myth of Western intellectual supremacy, share it with someone who needs to hear this. The buried record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.